Phil Nelson is a researcher and author of 4 amazing books: LBJ, the Mastermind of the JFK Assassination; a sequel, LBJ from Mastermind to the Colossus; a 3rd book, Remember the Liberty, Almost Sunk by Treason on the High Seas; and his most recent work, Who Really Killed Martin Luther King? The Case Against Lyndon B. Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover, which is a re-examination of the original government case against James Earl Ray. It shows that the entire case was based upon made-up facts, cunningly shaped to frame James Earl Ray, the stalker who never was. Ladies and gentlemen, Phil's presentation tonight is called Who Really Killed Martin Luther King? Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Phil Nelson.
Good afternoon, everyone. Does everybody hear me? Okay. Okay. Well. Okay. Okay. Before we get started, I would like to thank everyone who was involved in the production of this event. You've done a great job. Oops. I also want to give kudos to those who brought so many books. There's a great variety of books back there, and I hope you all have a chance to look through them or look at them and make some decisions to buy or not to buy. I myself did not bring copies of my books for sale. However, I did bring 3 books that will be raffled off in the raffle. I guess that's Saturday night. Whenever.
Saturday
afternoon. Okay. So if you bid high enough, then you can get a copy of one of the books. You have to be the highest bidder, of course. Okay, but it goes to a good cause. It goes to the JFK Historical, and the JFK CSI group from Kansas City, and everything they do. It supports everything they do. What do I do now? And among those who have books here, I just want to suggest to you that you take a close look at the new book that is just coming out. In the back, you'll see the fellow in the black hat. That is Casper DeLine. And he's put together an amazing set of chapters. I think he said there were 3 sections for the witnesses, for the authors. I'm not sure what, but you can check with him. He's simply taking orders. He has none for sale at the moment. On the other hand, we have Jack Roth, who does, and he has a place over here. And he did a series of telephone interviews with a lot of researchers, and I happen to be one of them. So my name, Phil Nelson, is chapter 3 of his book. So you might have a look at that book. It's, from what I've seen so far, it's terrific. I don't see him here tonight, but I really enjoyed being in the company of so many young people last night, and hope that those of you who were at Campese's with us did as well. That was great, and it reminded me of something that happened to me when I was 17 years old, which I think it put me on the trail that I've been on, because what happened, it was on February the 20th of 1961, when over the PA system, I was 16 years and 2 months old, and over the PA system in high school came this announcement that there was an airplane crash on LBJ's ranch. And I thought that was odd, and they said, well, he has a runway on the ranch, and they were trying to land a plane, and that's more or less all they said, except they said that it happened the previous day, the 19th. Well, as it turns out, they soon learned that that was a lie. It really happened on Friday, the 17th. The whole story is on one of my recent blogs at lbjthemasterofdeceit.com. So if you want to hear it's a very interesting story, and it's one of the first pieces of one of the first events that caught my attention at that young age, and from that young age, I had this, I guess you would call it a concern with Lyndon Johnson. It was only 1 month into the administration when this one happened. And it's only one among many. Okay, let's proceed. Now, okay, this talk was supposed to be about new events that happened after my 2 books on Martin Luther King were published. The first one was published in 2018, and that was a hardcover. And then the paperback came in 2020, and we had a number of revisions to it. Chief among them was a revision that put a foreword from Edgar Tatro in, and I also put an afterword in under my own name. And there were some other corrections, but there hasn't been much happening after that, because in 2017 is when they did the big release of a lot of documents, and some from the Martin Luther King assassination showed up in that. Well, the cause of that we're going to examine a little bit later, but aside from that, there's been no real release, and there's none scheduled until 2007. However, this thing came out in January 2021, about a year and a half ago, and it announces this plan that they're going to actually release the FBI audio. Well, for some reason, they couldn't get it done any time between, or before 2027. So the question, how did the 2017 Martin Luther King dump of documents get mixed in with the JFK set? The confusion was probably caused by the fact that the House Select Committee, formed to investigate the JFK assassination in 1976, was forced by the Congressional Black Caucus to expand its investigation to include a review of the Martin Luther King assassination as well. Thus did the records become intertwined. No one pushed for a reinvestigation of the RFK assassination because it was erroneously considered solved. The 50-year suppression of Martin Luther King's investigation begun in 1977 during that same House Select Committee period. Expires on January 31st, 2027. So I want to just mention this in passing because what happened beginning right after the December 23rd, 1963 FBI headquarters meeting, where they brought in special agents from around the country, especially from Memphis, St. Louis, Atlanta, Los Angeles, and they wanted to groom them to be prepared for what they referred to. In fact, it was the title of the meeting, the neutralization of Martin Luther King, Jr. Okay, so here we see some 1963 era, it was about that meeting, where they passed the word that Gus Hall, I guess head of the Communist Party, has stated King is a wholehearted Marxist who has studied it, Marxism, believes in it, and agrees with it. But because of his being a minister of religion, doesn't dare to espouse it publicly. And in addition, King has been described within the CP USA as a true, genuine Marxist-Leninist, from the top of his head to the tips of his toes. And so we have that. That was, at one time, the primary focus of the FBI, trying to prove he was a communist. And suddenly, after that neutralization meeting, that changed. The focus began to shift more on his the personal issues that he might have been having. But I want to talk about this guy here for a second, after I get some water. Some of you may recognize this slide because I've used it before. But it's that important to everything that goes from here on. Whatever I say, you have to look at it through the prism of what this guy was all about. You can almost see the smirkiness, the whatever you want to call it, in his face, and it does reflect him. He probably had 50 photos to choose from, and he chose this one. But he thought that looked good, I suppose. But he was a famed novelist. He was an old friend and crony of J. Edgar Hoover himself. Was given a mission to create a completely false meme for James Earl Ray. James Earl Ray was really just a misbegotten son, a boy that grew up in a sort of a poverty state in middle to north Illinois, not south. In fact, where he grew up was north of the latitude that Indianapolis, Indiana, Springfield, Illinois, Columbus, Ohio, that latitude. If he's north of that, how would you be calling him a southerner? So that's just for starters. He was termed a racist, and that was the basis of everything else. That he was a hater, stalker, murderer of Martin Luther King. The problem is, the premise of that was destroyed by the House Select Committee on Assassinations. The one good thing they did was they determined, and they actually wrote it out. I think we'll see a slide like that. Well, anyway, the point is that they took some of what Huey said. And by the way, Huey's whole book, all of his Look magazine articles, were the basis of the FBI report. The FBI report was not about really searching for the truth, because if they did that, they would have to indict themselves. How does that work? So they had to create a meme, and they hired a series of 3 novelists to create that meme. This guy was the first, and the others will come later. It's all spelled out in my book. So there's, and it's not just them, those 3, because in every decade after that, others like Gerald Posner, Hampton Sides, the list goes on. Well, even Larry Hancock and Stu Wexler, for that matter. Anyway, there are still books that support the original story. After Dr. Pepper, and all he's done in his 3 books, and of which I only added a few other insights, I think that stands, and you heard Ryan Jones explain why that is what they believe the truth to be. So if there's anybody wanting to hear a conspiracy theory involved in this case, look at the official narrative, which we're going to be getting to shortly. Okay, let's look at a few other Huey's lies about James Earl Ray. And altogether, if you'd have to have a CPA firm come in and do an audit to figure out how many hundreds or thousands of lies that are in his book about James Earl Ray. But then Huey reversed all that, called him the liar. Does that ring a bell with anybody? Throughout his travels, the stalker, Ray, is never in the same town as Martin Luther King until April the 4th, 1968. Yet they call him a stalker? How does that work? And this is all proven. I mean, it wasn't just me. I've got so much information from a book by Taylor Branch. That is at least I consider it the primary biography of Martin Luther King. But the biggest brazen lie was that, according to Huey, Ray went to Selma, Alabama on March 22nd, 1968 to stalk Martin Luther King, though King's most prominent biographer, that Taylor Branch, wrote that King was in Atlanta that entire day, had never even planned to be in Selma. He made it up out of thin air and put in the book. And then it shows up in all the FBI reports after that. All this stuff was meant to replace a thorough FBI investigation. This was what they came up with. And further, the other 2 authors that they hired, even at the time, wrote books with The first book was published in 1970. 1972, Gerald Frank wrote a book, and he was trying to focus on James Earl Ray's past and why he is the way he was. And he cited another person, some guy who got killed in an Indian war up in Montana, as being a possible grandfather. That's all he said. I mean, he didn't even try to attempt to prove the point. He could have done that through going through Ancestry.com, I think. Anyway, the lies continue. So considering everything else that the FBI made up about Martin Luther King, how likely is any of this being true? And I'm just going to try to leave some of these up so that you can read them while I'm talking, because I'm not going to read all this. But it was all about his sexual acts, whether natural as well as unnatural, whatever that means, for the entertainment of onlookers. And it's just about having sex orgies wherever he went. You have to believe that this is all BS. Most of it has to be, because we cited all the other lies that were produced to enhance the official story. When Dr. King went to Washington and stayed at the Willard Hotel, Dr. King was tricked into thinking that Lyndon Johnson was ever on his side, rather than merely pushing his own political agenda. When he accepted LBJ's invitation to come to Washington to stay at the Willard Hotel in January 1964, he showed up there with his entourage, and we don't really know whether everything or anything happened or everything happened. It's somewhere in between. I'm thinking it's more leaning toward the, not quite as what you're going to be seeing next. It proves that Martin Luther King was entrapped, obviously with LBJ's active participation to come to Washington for the purpose of being subjected to illegal surveillance. The FBI bugged his room in advance. Okay, now this is the official narrative. This comes right out of NARA, that is, National Archives Records Administration. And so this is the official findings of the US government. And it's all listed there, just, you know the narrative. James Earl Ray fired the shot, and so on. Led by Pulitzer Prize winner and weasel, David Garrow. This is why I've chosen this topic, because this is the only thing that's happened since I actually last presented. And what happened, and we're going to look into this a little bit further, but just let me try to calm myself. All the findings are BS, based upon books commissioned by the FBI to, well, can I say, cover their ass, by 3 novelists who made it up as they went along, as documented, well, my book. And I have this thing over here, it says notable supporters of this. All government agents, of course, are mandatory. 99+% of mainstream media, 95.5% of academia, and 100% of the Mary Farrell Foundation leadership, including authors Larry Hancock and Stu Wexler. So we'll just have to choose sides, I guess. This is dated June the 20th, 2019. It's the headline page of a little-known British right-wing magazine with David Garrow's article. So the title here is, Why is David Garrow still trying to crucify Martin Luther King, Jr.? He seemed to accept, uncritically, everything in the FBI files as fact, an absurdity on his face. Well, it's pretty certain that Dr. King did have a weakness for pretty women who undoubtedly threw themselves at him. It is also true that the heads of the FBI, Hoover, Tolson, Sullivan, Deloach, and all the others, were so anxious to get dirt on Martin Luther King that they paid agents bonuses to come up with the raunchiest stories they could possibly come up with. And I believe that 100%. I'm not sure if you can read it too well on the left, but I'll just read a little bit. So, and here's an assertion that you just have to you have to disbelieve. You cannot suspend disbelief when it comes to this stuff. They expose in graphic detail the FBI's intense focus on King's extensive extramarital sexual relationships with dozens of women, and also his presence in a Washington hotel room when a friend, a Baptist minister, allegedly raped one of his parishioners while King looked on, laughed, and offered advice. The FBI's tape recording of that criminal assault still exists today, resting under court seal in a National Archives vault by David Garrow. Even if it is there, which it probably is, you cannot believe, you cannot suspend your critical thinking to believe the garbage that's going to be coming out in another 4 or 5 years. But just for the hell of it. Now, I wouldn't have done this in this way had it not been for his article and this thing that is, he must have been paid a super bonus for this one. The next 6 slides will show excerpts from Garrow's 7,800 word article. One of the few true, we'll start with the one that's true. One of the few true and honest points made by Garrow's article. Proof that agents were rewarded for dirty work. The special squad that the FBI's Deke DeLoach deployed against civil rights advocates during the Democratic Convention at the behest of President Johnson has long been a well-known story in the annals of FBI abuses, but the newly released documents add memorable details to this infamous tale. And then I'm just going to skip over the details here and just to make the observation that the Johnson White House was highly impressed, and every agent involved received a financial reward. Democracy at work. More creative writing excerpts as ordered up by J. Edgar Hoover and treated as gospel truth by David Garrow. Just a small sample of many. Remember the context. Everything they did, all during their surveillance of him for 10 years, starting about 1957 intensely, and working up until, well, he was murdered. Okay, so do not suspend disbelief when you consider this stuff. At a February 1968 workshop to train ministers in urban leadership, it is alleged one Negro minister in attendance later expressed his disgust with the behind-the-scene drinking, fornication, and homosexuality that went on the conference. Several Negro and white prostitutes were brought in from the Miami area, and all-night sex orgy was held with these prostitutes. Sorry, let's go on. But it didn't stop there. He actually named names. He named not just these 3, you'll see others here. It was, and I'm not even going to repeat their names here because it's disgusting that they would stoop to this kind of level. I'm not saying none of it is true. I'm not saying that. I'm saying the whole thing is a lie, however. They've embellished everything. You have to understand that. Okay, among the FBI created dirt on Martin Luther King, which I knew was garbage, but David Garrow published as though they were true, were these gems. We'll skip down to the piece right below. The group met in his room and discussed which women among the parishioners would be suitable for natural or unnatural sex acts. When one of the women protested that she did not approve of this, the Baptist minister immediately and forcibly raped her. The typed summary states, parenthetically, citing blah, blah, blah. And then it goes on. Quote, King looked on, laughed, and offered advice. Period. Sullivan, or one of his deputies, then added in handwriting. Well, I read that wrong. What I just said there, that was in handwriting, that quote there. And finally, there's this little tidbit. If you want to read the first part of it yourself, that's up to you. It does end in a rather, nasty way. But anyway, so I'm just going to start where anyone familiar with King's often bawdy sense of humor would not doubt that quotation. So those are his words. This is not the FBI. That's him talking. Okay. And then below, additional future coverage in our plan to expose King for what he is. Hoover disagreed, instructing in his distinctive scrawl that White House liaison Cartha Deloach should show the summary memo to Walter Jenkins, President Lyndon Johnson's top aide. How David Garrow rationalizes FBI tyranny. I'm going to read what is underlined because I couldn't believe I was reading what I'm reading here. Until now, we're talking about all these warrants, so supposed warrants. You know, when you have a search warrant, as Brian Edwards was explaining previously, it needs to meet a lot of standards, you know, as he was explaining. And here, what was going on for many years, up until about, well, when Robert Kennedy tried to put some controls on it and failed, Hoover was just authorizing search warrants, whatever, searches and all that. He thought he was the authority. He was the seat of government, remember that? Yeah, he was head of the FBI, but he called it, and all of his top-level people called themselves the seat of government. Okay. How David Garrow rationalizes FBI tyranny. Until now, some voices in 2027 might have called for the physical destruction of all those historical records, notwithstanding how the FBI's electronic surveillance of King was not, under the regrettably relaxed standards of that time, in any way illegal. How does that work? But they were certainly unconstitutional. And there are their words right there in the Fourth Amendment. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue, but upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. This timer's not working.
No, I'll give you time.
Oh, okay. But how much time?
10 minutes.
Okay. Okay, here we have an article in the New York Times, June 4, 2019. David Garrow is called out by many authors and historians for his recklessness. And the reporter, Jennifer Schlusler, wrote, when David J. Garrow, the Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., sat down last spring to dig through a trove of previously unreleased government records, it was business as usual for a researcher known for his prodigious reporting and doorstop books. Wow. How about what real historians and authors? I'm going to do this very quickly because I'm running out of time. Okay. Here's a guy, Peter Ling at the University of Nottingham, pointed out that Garrow was excessively credulous, if not naive. And a gal named Jean Theoharis and others, made other comments. Theoharis commented, most scholars I know would penalize graduate students for doing this. And then another thing, Garrow may have published his work in the area to obtain personal attention for himself. Yeah, I think there's a lot to that one. Okay, so
knowing that justice has run its course in this tragedy.
Her youngest son, Dexter, testified his father's death is a tragedy which still remains a mystery for him.
And it has always been a feeling that there are many unanswered questions that have not been addressed.
Today's Matt Lauer spoke with Pulitzer Prize-winning King biographer David Garrow.
You said that the scene of James Earl Ray and Dexter King shaking hands was, quote, sad and surreal. Why?
Yes, Matt. I think it's very sad that the King family and the King children are so uninformed of the history that they could be open to believing that Mr. Ray was not involved in Dr. King's assassination. Mr. Ray was someone of long-standing racist, segregationist affiliations, and as the House Assassinations Committee very correctly concluded 19 years ago, Mr. Ray was probably the trigger man for a wider segregationist conspiracy to kill Dr. King.
But Dexter King and his family members are not the... Dexter, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Mr. Garrow seems to think that you and your family members are being duped by James Earl Ray and his attorneys. What's your reaction?
Well, I am very disturbed by his comments that anyone in this day and age of victims' rights would suggest that it is wrong for a family to question who killed their loved one. The fact of the matter is, I guess I'm really not surprised because Mr. Garrow, for whatever reason, is doing his job. And frankly, he is an agent for those forces of suppression who do not want this truth to come forward.
Unfortunately, the King family has not looked at the record that the House Assassinations Committee compiled 19 years ago. There's really no dispute among people that know this history well about Mr. Ray's guilt. The real questions that we should be pursuing and that Mr. King should be putting to Mr. Ray are who encouraged and who funded Mr. Ray to kill Martin Luther King Jr. That should be our focus.
Dexter?
I think what is really appalling here is that Mr. Garrow has built a platform on exploiting my father's legacy. If it were not for my family, Mr. Garrow would not have gained access to my father's papers and many other things that have given him a platform to speak out. And to now come back and say that we're misinformed is totally appalling.
What we have here and what people need to remember is that Mr. Ray, like other segregationist terrorists from the 1960s, did a tremendous amount of harm to the black freedom struggle. And for Mr. King to be misled into believing in mafia conspiracies is so unfortunately ignorant of the real.
I met Mr. Ray. He is not a segregationist. I've met segregationists. This man was not born in the South as the media portrayed at the time. The fact of the matter is he was born in Illinois. I met his family. They are not people who strike me as racist. The fact of the matter is this man was set up. And we need to deal with this so that we can move on. The American public deserves the right to know. Certainly the family of the victim deserves the right to know what happened to their loved one. We need to stop living in denial in this country.
Dexter?
And for once and for all, face this injustice.
The Reverend Jesse Jackson agrees somewhat with Mr. Garrow in saying that James Earl Ray does not deserve a trial until he begins to tell the truth, among other things saying that Raoul never existed. Would you at least agree with that he does need to tell a little bit more of the truth before a trial is warranted?
Well, first of all, Raul has been located. As I said, there's so many people who are talking about this case as if they're informed. They are the ones that are uninformed. They do not have the up-to-date, latest information.
Now we're going to switch subjects a little bit. How much time? 4 minutes. Okay. Now we're going to talk about Percy Foreman, the guy that somehow got recruited at the final hours at a certain time, just when James Earl Ray was coming to the conclusion that he was not being represented by the previous lawyers, and so suddenly he was ready to switch, and somehow the White House and the FBI headquarters knew all about that. Well, as he made that, because they had put so many cameras, microphones into his cell, they created this big white cell with no windows, access to no windows, and the lights were on full blast 24 hours a day. And so it wasn't exactly, and this went on for 8 months, by the way. And after his lawyers tried to get that fixed, it went nowhere because it was being governed from Washington. Okay. So Foreman convinced Ray that he had to plead guilty, but promised that it would save him from the death penalty, which hadn't been used in Tennessee for over 10 years. I think it's closer to, I think it was more like 20 years, but I didn't bother to look it up again. How would Percy Foreman or any lawyer ever seek out a client, assure him that he will fight for their freedom and betray them, forcing them to plead guilty, to ensure that they got maximum prison term possible, even vow to testify against them if they didn't? Wow, what a lawyer that was. But that's what happened. That's what Percy Foreman did. Because John Currington, in his 2018 book, stated that H.L. Hunt gave him a briefcase loaded with $125,000 in cash and told him to visit Foreman at his office and how to make the presentations. I laid it on the desk in front of him. I have 125,000 reasons why James Earl Ray should plead guilty to killing Martin Luther King. I said, Foreman looked at me and said, well, just leave them with me and I'll take a look at them. I walked out of the room, not having been there more than a minute or two. It was all laid out in advance. It was planned. Those words were constructed for him to say, probably at least by H.L. Hunt, if not higher. Okay, so FBI files in Foreman. I'm going to skip through this one because I'm not going to try to prove that point. The guy was a miserable SOB. But that memo continues on over here, and basically it's saying that Foreman identified himself to our Houston office as an attorney for Joseph Francis Savello, a top hoodlum of the Dallas division, who was in attendance at the Appalachian meeting. That was a 1957 raid, famous raid. Bureau files also revealed that an indictment was returned in Houston, Texas in October 1937, charging Foreman with subornation of perjury, a felony. And look down here, and this is the point, that red thing, that's Hoover. Just another shyster with that famous H. That's how he signed his memos. And, well, anyway, I guess the point is that he knew all about what a shyster this guy was in 1965. So if he was that bad, why did they pick? Well, never mind. The question answers itself. So for the rest of the story, over the next 30 years, Ray never received a fair criminal trial after being given the treatment by LBJ's pal, Percy Foreman, and railroaded into a life sentence in exchange for a plea bargain. The closest he got was being found guilty. The closest he got was being found innocent by a 1999 civil court jury. Unfortunately for him, he was already dead. So here you have the people. Here's William Bradford Huey. That's the guy I'm telling you. He created the monster that happened, the Leviathan, or whatever you want to call it, that took over James Earl Ray's life from then on. And you see Buford Ellington, Tennessee governor, great buddy of LBJ. They used to hunt together on the ranch and elsewhere. And there's Percy Foreman. He called himself the Texas Tiger. Oh boy, these are a real piece of work. And that's it. Questions?
Robert, if you don't mind, I've got a question I want to ask Phil. Phil, one of the things that you said during your presentation was that J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI spent a lot of effort trying to prove that Martin Luther King was a communist. Would it not be more accurate to say to portray him as a communist?
Well, yes, right. This was the height of the Cold War, and of course that just meant everybody had to be anti-communist 100% or 110% or more by some of the groups. By the way, I've met some John Birchers. I can't tell you how crazy that experience was, but I was just a kid working in Traverse City, Michigan for 3 summers in the 60s. And some of the people in the airport where I worked were John Birchers, and they were unbelievable. But anyway, it is what it is. So I lost my place. Did I answer the question?
Yes.
Hey, Phil, Robert Marr here. I have a 2-part question for you. Number one, you're saying, well, you know, was Martin Luther King a communist or a Marxist or whatever? Why would we ever think that, Phil? His number 1 aide was Stanley Levinson, the former number 1 funder of the Communist Party in the United States of America, who wrote all of MLK's speeches, who did all of his tax returns, who was a Jew, who was his closest ally and staunchest advocate. And second, go ahead, answer that one.
Okay, come on, give me a break.
Yeah.
May I answer that one first?
Yeah, because John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy went to MLK in summer of '63 and said, get rid of Levinson. By the way, I admire Stanley Levinson for his work on the civil rights movement. Go ahead.
Well, thank you for that note. However, that's a bunch of hooey as far as I'm concerned. You know, that you're...
Was he a communist, Stanley Levinson? Yes
yeah,
or
he
no?
was.
Okay.
So was he guilty by association? Is that it?
Was he MLK?
I have friends from
was he
the whole
MLK's
political
top
spectrum.
Was he MLK's top aide? Yes or no?
He left the Communist Party by the late 30s, early 40s.
Well, can you see why Hoover might think that King might be a communist? Not that I really disliked Stanley Levinson.
Okay, well, you know, we have a time limit here, don't we?
Okay. Well, the other question I have for you.
Well, there's another. Is there anyone else that would like to?
Hold on.
Are there any pending questions?
Yeah, I've got a question.
Yes, sir.
Who killed Martin Luther King?
You mean the shooters?
Like who's behind the whole thing? Was it LBJ?
That's the whole point of my book, yeah. The title of the book is Who Really Killed Martin Luther King Jr.? The case against Lyndon Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover. That's a subtitle.
Thank you, Phil. Mm-hmm. All right, ladies and gentlemen, Phil Nelson.